So today we have Nate Schenkkan, the project director for Nations in Transit at Freedom House, joining us from New York via Skype. Thanks for coming on, Nate.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the Aktobe attack in Kazakhstan. My first question is, who's behind the attack? What do we know about the attackers, and what follow-up has the government done over the past week or so in response?
Well, it's a great question. The truth is, we don't know who's behind the attack. At this point, the amount of information that's been released that can be verified by anyone outside of the government is not enough for us really to know the nature of the attack or to put the necessary credence into the government's version of events. So the government has asserted now quite clearly that they believe the attack to be caused by Islamist militants, which they would refer to as sort of pseudo-religious groups, and they've been pushing that line now fairly hard. The issue is that the information that's been released about the attackers, in terms of their names, who they are, some of it has been called into question. So there was one incident where one of the names that was released as the name of an attacker was actually the son of an opposition leader, and that son lives outside the country. He doesn't live in Kazakhstan right now, so that was quickly controverted and called into question the quality of information about the other supposed attackers. Sure. There's also the issue that the nature of the attack and the way in which the attack was conducted doesn't really fit with the profile of a group of externally supported and trained Islamist militants.
How so? Can you tell from the kind of weapons they were using, or did it just seem like it wasn't very well planned? What are the signs that lead to that?
It definitely is not well planned. Basically, the sequence of events is that you have a large group of young men who first attacked a gun store in Aktobe in the middle of the day. And a couple of people were wounded and killed, civilians, at that gun store. And then they took guns from that store. What that indicates, as, for instance, Bruce Pannier of Radio Free Europe has pointed out in one of his discussions about it, is that they didn't have money in advance to buy weapons, for instance, from the same gun store, nor did they have money to procure serious weapons, automatic rifles or these kinds of things. So that you have this kind of disorganized attack on a hunting store where they take some shotguns, then they go hijack a bus filled with civilians, but they don't attack those civilians. They force them off the bus. They basically hijack the bus and then go try to ram the gates of a military base where they're pretty much killed. It's extremely disorganized. No real operational planning, none of the kind of outward signs that you see of really highly trained or professionalized kind of terrorist attacks like you saw in France or like you've seen in Turkey.
Right, because the way you're describing it sounds almost spontaneous. So, is there anything going on recently in Kazakhstan in domestic politics or just maybe the broader economic situation there that would have led to this kind of spontaneous burst of outrage?
Yeah, that's certainly one plausible theory, is that you have people who've been frustrated with the economic situation. Kazakhstan's in the middle of a recession right now due to the collapse in oil prices and due to the economic crisis in Russia, where Kazakhstan, of course, is very closely connected economically. So you have a lot of frustration. You've had for Kazakhstan, rather large protests in the past month over the issue of land reform. But I should say, the government has tried very hard to connect these two things, to talk, and President Nazarbayev himself has talked about them in the same breath, to say the protests are essentially the same thing as these kinds of terrorist attacks. I think we should be very wary of making that connection until we actually know more about who these young men are and why they went out on this kind of suicide mission. And the last thing I would say just about the nature of the attacks, you also didn't have any of the kind of outward stuff that you've seen in typical Islamist terrorist attacks. You don't have anybody screaming Allahu Akbar in the middle of Aktobe. You don't have the release of videos of themselves, claiming allegiance to ISIS, holding up one finger and indicating that this is for the unity of God, this kind of thing. It's a very strange and disconcertingly uncertain kind of event to have happen.
And so let's talk a little bit about the government's reaction. I saw President Nazarbayev came out with a statement basically saying that they were going to review the foreign funding of NGOs operating in Kazakhstan because of this. I mean, what's the reasoning there, and why would it be in the interest of the Kazakh government to use this sort of as a scapegoat foreign agencies like that?
Yeah, like I said, they've been folding this into the whole discussion about the land reform protests, which the state media has blamed on outside forces. And state media, a lot of it has been accusing those behind the protests, those involved in organizing the protests, of essentially trying to create a color revolution scenario. Nazarbayev has now embraced that. It seems like he's going to now use this to further tighten Kazakhstan's laws on freedom of association and freedom of assembly. An important thing to note, though, about that is that Kazakhstan already has incredibly tight laws about this stuff, and that they've been tightened in the past 2 years. Kazakhstan actually implemented a new law last year called the Operator Law that imposes a huge amount of government monitoring and government surveillance onto all NGOs in the country that receive any kind of foreign funding. So it's not like they operate in some open legal environment in the first place.
Okay. Could this be a sign of future instability to come in Kazakhstan? And is this also reflective of sort of wider concerns in the region of Central Asia?
In terms of the first question, yes, I think there is a legitimate concern about future instability in Kazakhstan. And I would say the biggest reason is that if you think about authoritarianism, if you think about dictatorship as a kind of performance, and the dictator, leader, needs to be able to perform the authority with which he rules the country, and it only works so long as people believe in it, believe that he has that authority. Right now, President Nazarbayev is leaking authority left and right. The government and the president, they keep flubbing their lines about what has happened. None of the explanations make sense. They're trying to wrap together things that aren't related and that people know aren't related. People in Kazakhstan aren't stupid. They know these things aren't connected. And so the danger is that this government loses all credibility and loses the ability to dictate the narrative like it really has for the last 20 years. In terms of Central Asia more broadly, the core reason for the protests, the core reason for the discontent in Kazakhstan is the economic crisis. And frankly, that economic crisis is just as serious, if not worse, in the rest of Central Asia, where the collapse in oil prices and gas prices is hitting Turkmenistan equally hard. And then the collapse in labor remittances from migrant laborers who work mostly in Russia is hitting Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, very hard. So you have a real serious economic crisis that's now been going on for about a year and a half. It has no signs of ending for any of these countries, and it is definitely the case that people are starting to get frustrated. They're starting to say, why don't we have any better solutions?
Okay, Nate. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk and joining us.